Good morning, everyone. Welcome. If people could get seated, we're about to start. Oh. Good morning. We're starting now. Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning. I'm Aditi Mehta, Assistant Professor of Urban Studies at the University of Toronto. And welcome to the Civic Lab TO curriculum focused on building an equitable city. I'm really excited for today's session. Diversity is our strength is Toronto's famous city motto. And according to StatsCan, approximately 52% of the city's population is a visible minority, and over 50% of residents are immigrants. When I moved here from Boston, Massachusetts 5 years ago, I was delighted to move to a city where so many people looked like me. And yet every day, data, lived experiences, and news headlines remind us of the stark inequalities embedded in our city. So for example, at the height of the pandemic in 2020, 21% of reported COVID cases affected Black people, who only make up 9% of the city's population. The rate of unaffordable housing in the city has persistently been roughly 10% higher for South Asian, Black, and Chinese households compared to non-racialized households over the last 15 years. Communities of color and Indigenous populations in Toronto are over-policed. Indigenous populations experience higher rates of homelessness. So how do we really make the city a safe home for all its people, where individuals have the capacity to aspire, where every individual has the capacity to aspire? As we discuss how to build an equitable city today, we should also consider how we build public consciousness about social injustice and obtain knowledge to make sense of our social realities in the first place. For instance, we know there's a critical gap in data about Toronto's urban Indigenous community, which is grossly undercounted. Data and news inform policies, plans, and programs, and without the right information, interventions may be flawed. So we are really lucky to hear from a wonderful panel of city practitioners today that are working very hard to build an equitable city and address some of the issues I just shared and change those narratives. I would like to now share a land acknowledgement. As this meeting is both in person and virtual, we're not all gathered in the same place. I recognize that this land acknowledgement may not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. For those of us in Toronto, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So to provide a brief description of today's event, the Civic Lab TO curriculum is presented by Strategic Partnerships and the City Manager's Office within the City of Toronto in collaboration with the 8 higher education institutions represented here today. We are thrilled to be hosting this year's Civic Lab TO curriculum in Committee Room 1, and this is a very unique learning space to be in. This is the second year I'm teaching the course, and I'm really excited to be here. The City of Toronto secured an amazing lineup of senior staff and policy experts for each of the sessions, and thank you to all of our partners who have made this possible. So before I pass it on to our guest speaker for today's sessions, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded, and participants are asked not to share any personal information within the meeting. This session will be available on civiclabto.ca or civiclabto.ca/curriculum and made available to your instructors in the near future. And if you have joined us in person here in Committee Room 1, welcome, and please note that we ask that you avoid joining the virtual WebEx webinar. The washrooms are located in the hallways by the elevators. I believe that's that way. And you can go and use the washrooms whenever you'd like. There will be time for Q&A at the end of today's event. And if you're joining the session virtually, and would like to submit a question during the session, please enter it into the Q&A feature at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you're joining us in person, you are welcome to ask questions using the microphones located around Committee Room 1 and at the debutant desk. Again, we remind you to avoid disclosing any personal notes when asking questions. Lastly, everyone joining us virtually will be manually muted during the event. If you are in Committee Room 1 and have joined the WebEx meeting, please mute your device's speakers. So today, we're going to hear from Janice Alvarez, Project Director of People and Equity, Mohammed Shurier, Director of Community Safety and Wellbeing, and Jennifer LaFontaine, Consultant to Indigenous Affairs Office. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jennifer Alvarez. Thank you.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Is my mic on? Everyone can hear me? Good. Thank you for pulling up the slides. So today I will be talking to you about working to build a more equitable city. So I want to start by thanking you all for taking the time today to share this morning with us and for having these important conversations. As mentioned, my name is Janice Alvarez. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Project Director for Business Transformation and Equity Alignment with the Equity and Human Rights section of the People and Equity Division. And I am painfully aware that that means absolutely nothing to you yet, but I will go through our work and kind of situate how we fit into the broader city. Next slide. Oh, next slide was my introduction, but anyway, moving on. Next slide, please. Awesome. So equity and reconciliation are foundational principles that flow through all activities and services and operations within the public service. As you know, the pandemic has placed a spotlight on pre-existing and as well as emerging systemic barriers faced by Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving groups, and highlights the need to further embed and enhance efforts across the city. So really today I'm going to be talking to you about first really understanding what we mean when we talk about equity. So going over some foundational concepts. Secondly, equity at the city. So what we are doing to advance equity. And thirdly, as what I see as the future of equity and how we can kind of work together to drive impact. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before I jump into the main content of the presentation, I'm going to take a couple minutes to lay the groundwork to ensure that we have a shared understanding of what we are discussing today and why, and an overview that highlights some of the key concepts and purpose of why we're together today. Next slide, please. So as mentioned in the introduction, the city of Toronto is one of the most diverse cities in the world, but it continues to be built, shaped, and improved by the contributions of Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving groups. However, these groups continue to face significant inequities and barriers that result in historical and ongoing systemic barriers. So just to situate that, next slide, please. I won't go through every one of these data points, but just to situate it, we're seeing that, for example, data shows us that Black communities are over-policed. We see persons with disabilities disproportionately experience food insecurity. We see often Indigenous communities as well as 2S LGBTQ communities disproportionately experience homelessness or precarious housing. And that poverty is disproportionately experienced by Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving groups. And this is not happenstance, this is not accident. These are structural and systemic barriers that have been created that impact the life chances of different groups. So just getting into the next slide. First, we're just going to talk about what we mean when we say equity and how it's distinct and separate from equality. So this is an image that, to be honest, I don't personally love, but it's very common in the equity space that's used. So I'll describe it in a minute, but essentially equality strives for the same treatment for all people, whereas equity is based on the realization that not all people start with the same life chances. It therefore aims to understand, acknowledge, and remove barriers that prevent participation of any individual or group, make fair treatment, access, opportunity, advancement, and outcomes possible for all individuals. So in this image here, you see left that it is, you'll see that the ground is not even here, that to begin with, not all folks are standing on that level ground, that they don't start with the same life chances. And then if you give them all the same supports, which is that box, that yes, it brings them maybe closer to looking over the fence, but they're not quite able to actually participate in that sporting event. The next, you see that the equity is like, you understand that there's not that level ground, so you provide different supports for different folks. But ultimately, we need to scrutinize and look at the systems, which is the fence itself. What are the barriers that we are creating that are preventing people from actually full participating? So rather than needing to provide folks with supports, let's actually be critical of the systems that are requiring them to need supports themselves. Moving to the next slide. You'll see that throughout the presentation, I have also been quite deliberate to distinguish between equity and reconciliation very intentionally. And often at the city and just in general, generally in the space, often these concepts are very much coupled together, but they are very distinct. So reconciliation is separate from equity as it recognizes, respects, and promotes the unique rights and needs of Indigenous peoples and strives towards intentional impact on economic, social, cultural, structures with particular emphasis on the rights to land and resources. It is premised upon truth, justice, and self-determination. And these are unique concepts in our relationship with this country and their histories with Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. So when we talk about, use this terminology of Indigenous, Black, and equity deserving groups, I kind of want to unpack this a little bit to say, who exactly are we talking about here? So often, so first of all, I just want to say that the city has recently moved from the terminology of equity seeking to equity deserving, understanding that this, for some folks, this might just be semantics, but I think that this is actually really important to understand that equity seeking puts the onus on these communities to say, okay, like you can strive for equity, whereas equity deserving understands that we've created systems that are placing barriers and disadvantaging these systems. So it's all of our responsibility to actually deliver and advance equity for these communities. The burden shouldn't be on folks that are already being marginalized by these systems. But also when we talk about these groups, I've listed 10 on this, but I also want to recognize that within these 10 groups, these are very diverse communities that we're talking about. So for example, we say Indigenous communities, but that's not even best practice because that's a very homogenous term for very diverse communities. So really we're talking about First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. Next we have women, we have Black communities, racialized communities, 2S LGBTQ communities, persons with low income, persons with disabilities, youth facing barriers, seniors facing barriers, as well as immigrants, refugees, and undocumented workers. And by no means am I claiming that this is an exhaustive list. This is kind of a starting point with which we start the conversation at the city, but also understanding that there's a great deal of intersectionality within these groups. People don't walk around with like one particular identity, but often the barriers that they face are compounded by multiple identities listed on this slide. Next slide, please. So before we dive into some of the work that the city is doing, I also wanted to clarify that when we talk about equity and reconciliation, we're talking about both process as well as outcomes. So it's not just the what we are delivering, but the how we are going about doing this work as well. So we see internal equity-focused staffed initiatives, commitments, and complements as being integral to activating the full potential of the outward-facing activities that we do at the city, which is why we've developed a more nuanced approach to advance both workforce equity, internally looking at the city, as well as service equity, which recognizes that they're really linked, but they have distinct goals and activities related to them. So workforce equity is really looking internally at the city. For example, are we representative of the populations that we serve in the city? Is that representation only at the lowest levels of the organization, or do we have those verticals where diverse communities have access to decision-making powers and have what they say a seat at the table? And then when we talk about service equity, it's what I was referring to earlier, those systemic barriers, the programs and services we provide, and how we can remove barriers and be proactive about creating more inclusive and equitable programming. So it's really important to understand that a lot of these key initiatives that we will be discussing today support horizontally driving both service as well as workforce equity. Next slide, please. Just to, if that wasn't clear already, equity is complex. And this is for a number of different reasons. So when we look at equity, it's first understanding that we're talking about groups that have very distinct, diverse experiences. Even, we can say Black communities, even within the Black community, you can dissect, like there's so many different interacting barriers and experiences and life chances that happen based on where you're from, how you experience the world as well. So just even the terminology itself can often be limiting, and often in the space, people treat it as homogenous and monolithic, but how can we add the depth and complexity to understand these dynamic experiences? Secondly is around the breadth of city services. So the city of Toronto is actually larger than most provincial governments. So that is over 40,000 staff in over 40 divisions providing very diverse services. So we have things from solid waste management to public health to shelters across the board. So you can imagine that embedding equity considerations into such large scale processes and activities is never an easy feat. The definition itself is equity space is evolving. It changes. It needs to be responsive to the changing needs of community. So how can we really understand, like, what is a common definition? What are common outcomes? How can we have within an organization so large, have that North Star or common vision for how we are advancing equity? And lastly, and I'm sure everyone is acutely aware of this, but also, even though we kind of talk about the pandemic as a thing of the past, the impacts of the pandemic are still being felt and are very real for folks. So understanding that the social and economic conditions within the city are increasing inequities. So our understanding of that kind of has to evolve as we go along as well. So moving to the next slide in the next section, now we're going to be talking a little bit about equity at the city itself. So we can move on to the next slide. So we have at the city what we, this is kind of a little graphic that we've created, and it's called the Equity and Reconciliation Infrastructure. So this is a decentralized model where subject matter expertise, community advisors, resources, and tools are located across the organization. So in other words, while there are places and people in the city that are mandated to do or focus on particular issues to advance equity or reconciliation for the residents of Toronto, it's really everyone's work at every level of the organization to embed this into what they're doing. So this is really focused on how can we address the root causes of inequity to drive better outcomes for communities as well. So you'll see that there are 6 different pillars in this infrastructure that we continue to evolve and drive that continuous improvement lens on. So those pillars are strategic action plans, support units, tools, resources, training, data, policies, processes, and community engagement. And this is not, like I mentioned, this is not meant to be a static model. It's very iterative. And under each of those, you'll see a short description of what is meant by them. But at the bottom, you'll see 2 columns. So the first column is kind of what my office does, which is at EHR, which stands for Equity and Human Rights, and then other work that's also going on across the city. So you can kind of situate what we mean when we say support units and have examples of that, what we mean when we say policies and processes or data, and how that actually comes into play. So how we move equity from, once again, concept to more concrete actions. And I'm going to get into some of those examples as well. The next slide, please. So just situating our work, when we talk about support offices and we talk about this decentralized infrastructure, this is broadly what a lot of that core equity and reconciliation work looks like at the city. So within our corporate strategic plan that's located or coming out of the city manager's office, we really have that oversight, and we need that leadership support to drive that vision to embed equity and reconciliation as a core principle that is embedded in everything we do at the city. Then we have the People and Equity Division that I'm a part of, and the Equity and Human Rights section that's composed of 7 different teams, which is including the equity unit, accessibility unit, data for equity unit, the gender equity unit, the human rights office, the reconciliation and equity learning team, and finally the workforce equity unit. We also have our colleagues in so social development, finance and administration, which you'll be hearing from shortly, that have a number of really community focused strategies and action plans that are also continuing to advance equity. And then finally, one of my colleagues, Jennifer, you'll be hearing from the Indigenous Affairs Office and how they continue to advance reconciliation and embed decolonizing practices across the organization. And finally, just at the bottom, I explicitly put divisions, agencies, and corporations because all the teams that we listed, these are not a ton of people for a city our size and even the public service our size. So we really rely on, we're not doing the work, we're creating the conditions under which every division, agency, and corporation is responsible for doing this work. So I can't go into, Toronto Employment and Social Services and tell them this is how you should do your business. I can advance the conversation, bring tools to bear, bring policies to bear that enable and catalyze them to embed that into their own work. Next slide, please. This is just kind of the mandate. I won't go into this in too much detail, but the mandate of the equity and human rights section in particular, so honing in, and we're really trying to drive that outcomes focused approach through capacity building, so strengthening equity and human rights capacity across the organization, accountability, driving common purpose and accountability with strategic advice and initiatives. Then we have compliance, which is providing guidance and compliance on policy, legislative obligations, and risk mitigation. And then finally, we have data, leveraging data and insights to drive evidence-based decision-making. And to the right-hand side, I always try to ground the work in, it's not just about doing the activities, but are we moving the dial with these activities? So just providing some examples from January to June this year, how we've actually made an impact in the organization, some of those metrics and how we've moved the dial. The next slide is a little overwhelming, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but I wanted to just highlight that these are, that the work that we're doing, these are small but mighty teams driving systemic work. We are not trying to have a particular event. We're trying to look at culture of the city and the systems. And these are some of the current work that's underway, as well as some of the upcoming work that we're doing to really support the organization to drive equity and advance it. Next slide. So just going into what is the future of equity and how can we build for better? So while completely understanding that, we can actually move to the next slide, that this work is very important, and just situating why we need to prioritize it. So first of all, we see the expanding of that equity and reconciliation infrastructure that I talked about. So that requires alignment and integration. We want to make sure we're not duplicating efforts, but how are we creating those complementary efforts that can further impact? Second, we're seeing, as I'm sure you've all heard in the news, there's extraordinary financial pressures that the city is facing. That is going to impact decision-making, and there's going to be some difficult deliberations that need to be made. So how can we ensure that an equity lens is being placed within those deliberations? Increasing inequities. We see that there's a number of factors that are converging, resulting in growing social and economic inequities across the city. So how can we ensure that we are understanding the drivers of that and mitigating against that? And finally, we're seeing a new term of council, which is so exciting. It's the most diverse term of council that we've ever had in the city's history. And they've really demonstrated that they have an interest in seeing how we can advance and embed equity in our work. So how can we work with our political counterparts to really make sure that we are capitalizing on this moment to drive this forward? Next, I just highlighted some of the opportunities that we can highlight this work. Yeah, you can move forward. Thank you. Is through enhancing accountability and embedding equity into processes and structures that were never designed with these considerations in mind. Next is around data and measurement. We need to more effectively collect data so that we understand if our interventions are making a difference or how we can do this work more effectively. I mentioned already alignment, how we can work collaboratively together to understand intersectional experiences and drive better outcomes. And finally, building staff capacity so that the entire organization understands that this is not a nice to have, it's a requirement of working at the city. And my last two slides, which I won't get into, are just some of those grounding examples that I was talking about, how we are emerging opportunities that we are looking to advance equity with the gender equity strategy and the data equity strategy that will be going to executive and council in the upcoming months. So feel free to tune in and see how that evolves as well. So with that, I will stop and pass it on.
Thank you so much, Janice, and thank you for highlighting the difference between reconciliation and equity for everyone as well. Next, we'll have Mohammed Shurieh, Director of Community Safety and Wellbeing.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Come on. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for joining us here at City Hall. Congratulations to all of you who made it through the security check. And for you at home, welcome. So I'm going to talk about building an equitable city through the work that I do at Social Development and Finance Administration. But I'll first begin with a little bit about my journey and how I came to be here today and the work that I do. So I, much like 51% of the population here in our great city, was born elsewhere. I came to Canada in 1989 as a 5-year-old and went to school here and then went off to do my undergraduate in Montreal. And then I went off to go do my master's in the UK and then came back. Throughout that time, I had a keen interest in sort of being involved in different initiatives, including environmental initiatives. So was involved in a few not-for-profits, including the David Suzuki Foundation. And then wanted to some way, somehow get involved in government, and in particular municipal government. So in 2012, I applied to the Toronto Urban Fellow Program, which is a program for a recent master's and PhD or law degree graduates, and was selected to be part of that program. And started in 311 Toronto as a 6-month stint in that division of the city. And my job was to help develop a social media plan for that department. And then from there, moved around, was involved in municipal license standards for a little bit, where I helped co-author and implement a chicken pilot. And I know Mr. Mihevik is here. He was the city council at the time advocating for that chicken pilot. And I was the city staff who helped implement that chicken pilot. I then went off and worked with the United Way campaign within the city, and then made my way towards Social Development and Finance Administration in the first ever Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit in North America, and the first one in the city of Toronto. And I'll talk a little bit more about that work and how monumental that work was in helping us build an equitable city. And then made my way into the Policing Reform Unit in 2020 to implement the package of reforms City Council passed. And I'm here today talking to you about that work and the broader community safety and well-being work. So if I can have the next slide, please. In terms of what is Social Development and Finance Administration, it's, the city has acronyms that we love, SDNFA, if you want to use the acronym. It's a small and mighty team. It's a team of about 336 individuals in our division, with a budget of about $128 million. Now, that may seem a lot, but the city's budget is $16 billion. So it's a small part of the city's greater budget. And we help try and drive equitable, inclusive, and safe neighborhoods and communities through programs, policies, and engagement with communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we do that. We also try and build intergovernmental and community partnerships. We're oftentimes seen as the front door to a lot of community organizations, residents, and individuals trying to organize in their communities. We are often the first place that gives seed funding or grants to communities who want to organize a range of activities, from organizing a local meeting with their community partners to discuss safety concerns, or to discuss or to celebrate a cultural event, or to even organize a youth event. And then we're also oftentimes the organization that helps engage and mobilize communities in terms of addressing violent incidents that have occurred and or issues of major concern that have occurred in different communities. Our job is to support and provide oversight to the city's community and social services to help ensure that our mandate is met. And we support that through lots of different ways. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides, but at a high level, there are many different units within SDF&A, some that focus around poverty reduction, others that focus around, as I mentioned, the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit. You'll see on the right-hand side, the Toronto Welcomes Everybody. That's part of our Toronto for All campaign. We've been running these campaigns for, I think, close to 15 years. These are public awareness campaigns that address various different key public issues from Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, recognizing the Indigenous placemaking in our city, as well as addressing disability discrimination and many other things. So if I can have the next slide, please. I did not start a timer, so I will try and be cognizant of time. But how do we build an equitable city? I think we do it through three key levers at SDF&A, or Social Development and Finance Administration. One is by activating people. So, we support lots of various different community engagements in terms of actively engaging in our policy and program delivery. So one example is we have a poverty reduction strategy, but what good is a strategy if we don't have people who have lived experience of poverty helping to dictate and be informed and shaping that policy? So we have a lived experience advisory council where people who identify as living with poverty and experiences in terms of poverty help shape and influence the policy and the programs and the understanding so that we can ensure that the policy reflects the people's experiences. We also help empower and mobilize communities. So during COVID, one of the biggest challenges was vaccine hesitancy in a lot of different communities. And it's well and good to have doctors get in front of the camera and tell people, do the good thing, get vaccinated. But there was a lot of misinformation and questions within communities. So we worked with various different community groups and organizations to build out a community vaccine ambassadors program, hiring, empowering people, neighbors in their communities to go talk to other neighbors, in particular communities that have high racialized communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, and others, to help empower so that people were having conversations with their community members about why it was important to take the vaccine, how to take the vaccine, what were some of the side effects if they want to learn more information about that. So that's an example of how we activate people and build community capacity. Another key thing that we do is we help activate resources. And a large way that we activate resources is through funding. I talked earlier about how a lot of community organizations, individuals oftentimes get their first grant from our division, Social Development and Finance Administration. We have a community funding unit that has about $25 million a year to distribute in various different initiatives. So that's one way that we directly activate resources and support communities. And part of that funding envelope that we are building out in terms of the consideration of equity is ensuring that we have considerations around Black funded mandates in terms of community organizations that are Black, but also ensuring that we think about Indigenous funding framework as well and building out what that looks like with the Indigenous community. Another key way that we think about activating resources is through our community benefits program. So the city, like I mentioned earlier, has a $16 billion budget. As you can imagine, we buy a lot of things like pens, lots of stuff. I know I said pens, but we build buildings, we pave roads, we do lots of things with that $16 billion. So why not hire and build capacity of various diverse vendors? Why don't we prioritize diverse vendors? So that's part of the thinking behind the community benefits program. So one initiative that we worked with various different divisions, including people in equity, but also the procurement office, is to build out social procurement. This idea that we prioritize and give funding of contracts to diverse vendors. And through that program, we've been able to fund $6.4 million worth of contracts to diverse vendors. These are vendors that identify themselves as either Indigenous-led, Black-led, and or women-led, and or 2S LGBTQ-led vendors, and that are small vendors. And they've received also close to $9 million through subcontracts. So this idea of opening up the city's spending power to ensure that we're given resources directly to vendors who come from diverse populations. Another key element of expanding resources is through our Rexdale Casino Woodbine Community Benefits Agreement. The Rexdale Casino Woodbine development is a huge development in Northwest, and I'm not sure if there's anybody here from Rexdale and Etobicoke, but it's a major initiative that's underway that has a casino there. And we work with Toronto Employment Social Services and the vendor who runs the casino, the Great Canadian Gaming Corporation, to think about how do we support that local communities are benefiting from these contracts or benefiting from this work. And so one of the ways we work with them is by building out a community benefits agreement to ensure that there are hiring targets for both hiring local populations, hiring youth, and setting those hiring targets, monitoring those hiring targets, and then reporting out on those hiring targets. That's part of the work that we do in terms of activating resources. My colleague Janice talked earlier a little bit about equity responsive budgeting, which is another thing that SDF&A works with people in equity in terms of ensuring that we sort of ingrain within the practices of the city every time we are designing a budget to think about who is this budget impacting? What is the net positive or negative impact on equity deserving communities? And how do we ensure that we think about that and also consider that in every budget decision? And that's something that we support at Social Development Finance Administration. Last but not least, the one that I'll talk more about is the idea of around activating policies and systems change. This is really the big lever, and I think it behooves us to first stop and say that this lever doesn't necessitate change immediately. Change takes some time, but in this lever, we see research and data. Research and data is a key piece. A lot of the work that we do is take population data, either from StatsCan, from the census, but also social well-being data, and try and produce reports that show how different communities are living in our city. So we work with partners like United Way of Greater Toronto to produce reports that show some of the inequities in our city to help build policy decision-making evidence to see where we need to take action together. And the other thing is also around training and culture change within the city divisions. It's a lot of the work that we do, as well as support that work, but more broadly helping to build the policy capacity to support an equitable city. So I'll go into a few more examples in the next slide. One of the biggest initiatives, and I was lucky enough to be part of the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, is in terms of activating people. In March of 2016, Black Lives Matter Toronto organized a protest outside of Toronto Police Headquarters and called for dramatic change after the death of Andrew Loku and highlighted the systemic discrimination and barriers faced by Black Torontonians, representing only 9% of the population, but overrepresented in over policing and negative interactions with the police, overrepresented in terms of having higher food insecurity, overrepresented in terms of having higher housing insecurity, and calling for the city to actually use its levers to take dramatic change. So the division, Social Development Finance Administration, was tasked with doing a review and engaging community. And the first thing that we did is, this isn't a new conversation. Let's start there. This is a conversation that Black community members have been highlighting to the city for over the past 40 years. So we did a review of all the recommendations that came over the past 40 years, 113 recommendations in various different major reports, I think close to 16 or 17 seminal reports, and looked at what were some of the key themes and what of these recommendations have been advanced and which of these recommendations have not been advanced. And then pulled together extensive community consultations to validate, well, what are some of the needs identified right now, and pulled together to City Council's consideration a strategy moving forward, a 5-year strategy that had 22 recommendations and 80 actions. You'll see very quickly at the city we like strategies, and the reason why we like strategies is it allows us to measure what our outcomes are. It allows us to identify and articulate what the challenges are, and allows us to dictate and make very clear what journey are we on. And that's the purpose behind the Confronting Anti-Black Racism strategy. And through that strategy, we identified key needs to identify funding for the city, greater engagement within Black communities, and building the capacity in terms of a partnership and accountability circle. Building capacity externally, but also building capacity within Black staff and addressing some of the challenges faced within the City of Toronto. So this is a major seminal piece of work. City Council last year just adopted another 10-year Confronting Anti-Black Racism strategy. And a key component of the strategy is that it remains community informed and community built. The Partnership and Accountability Circle every year writes their own report on the city's performance. So it isn't city staff and the city saying, look how great we are, we accomplished X, Y, Z. It is city staff reporting out on the outcomes, but then it is a partnership accountability circle made up of community representatives, also outlining some of the areas where the city has more work to do or highlighting some of the key successes the city has had. If I could have the next slide, please. Another major way that we support communities through resources. And I talked a little bit about the community benefits agreement and talked about employment and talked about community funding, the $25 million envelope. But in this slide, it's really at a high level through this idea of SAFE-TO, which I'll get into a little bit more in a second. But the City of Toronto has a community safety and well-being strategy that pulls in together various different initiatives, close to 60 different initiatives that identifies how are we addressing the vulnerabilities experienced by our equity deserving communities and our Indigenous communities, and what are we doing to pull together various partners to address that. And so we were able to secure $12 million in the 2022 cycle to help support, in specific, the development of a gun violence strategy, recognizing that has a high disproportionate impact on Black communities, in particular has a high impact on youth communities in our city. And we know that gun violence is in particular a higher risk for people who live in certain areas in our city than others. And so we wanted to ensure that we built our funding to address that. We also were able to leverage intergovernmental resources, close to $14 million from the federal government to help support a coordinated effort on this strategy. And we've been able to, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, build an engagement from our multi-sector partners. Addressing community safety is not just the city's responsibility. Through the SAFE-TO strategy, we're trying to broaden the engagement of both Toronto Police Services, our social housing provider, Toronto Community Housing Corporation, our school board partners, both the public school board, the Catholic school board, but also our business improvement areas, our businesses, and then also considering our social service providers. So how do we collectively as a community, with the engagement of residents, think about safety and what are improvements that we can do in different neighborhoods to support safety? If we have the next slide. Another major way that we support change at the city and support equity is through policies and systems change. So I'll talk a little bit about this work, but I'm not sure how many of you have heard about the Toronto Community Crisis Service, but this is a major initiative that came out of the 2020 policing reform conversation. If you might remember, after the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, Minneapolis, there was calls, a racial justice movement erupted across North America, and calls for a conversation around what the role of policing was and a need to reconsider the role of policing, and a conversation around the disproportionate impacts of communities facing over policing, Indigenous, Black, and equity deserving communities. So the City of Toronto in June of 2020 passed 36 recommendations for policing reform. One major plank of that is the need to look into alternative community safety models. Why is it that we have police responding to mental health calls, which are essentially public health calls? And how do we think about what other alternatives can we support that will help better support individuals? So the team and I, when I was the manager of policing reform, were tasked with investigating this question, engaging community. We did 33 community conversations with 17 community partners. We centered the conversation on communities that have experienced over policing and had most concerns about policing, Indigenous, Black, and equity-seeking communities. We worked and partnered with organizations such as Black Cap, CAFCAN, Two-Spirit People of the First Nations, a Native Child, and many others to support conversations around this question. We also looked at jurisdictions across North America for best practices, including in Winnipeg, the Bear Patrol Clan, which is an Indigenous-led crisis response service. We also looked at Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, and then basically built out the City of Toronto's own model, the Toronto Community Crisis Service, which is a city partnered initiative with 4 organizations, not-for-profits in different neighborhoods. Oops, I shouldn't touch the mic. The Northwest, the Northeast, downtown, and an Indigenous-led partner, Two-Spirit People of the First Nations. And the idea is now in those 4 areas of the city, if you are in a mental health crisis, or if you know somebody who is and want to help provide support, you can call 211 and a mobile team of trained mental health clinicians will arrive at your door to help provide that support. We'll provide follow-up supports and we'll be able to, if necessary, transport that individual to the hospital. This is groundbreaking and has not happened anywhere else in North America. This was the first initiative launched in March of 2022. And to this date, this initiative has responded to over 8,000 calls for service and provided supports to Indigenous, Black, and equity-seeking communities, and have successfully diverted 78% of the calls they've received from 911 from having a police response. So this is an example of systemic change, and we're going to be going forward to City Council or the City Executive Committee shortly with a recommendation to consider expansion so that this is available across the whole city. It's available 24/7 in 4 key areas, and I can talk more about it. I can talk about it all day, but I'll stop and switch to the next slide. Thank you. So I talked a little bit about SafeTO, and I just want to stick on this for a little bit. It's a major piece of the work that I do as the Director of Community Safety Wellbeing. SafeTO came about from a provincial direction that said we need to think about safety more broadly than just being a police problem or a police lens. We need to engage all partners of society to think about safety and how do we support safety. So in 2019, the Ontario mandated that all municipalities should have a community safety and wellbeing plan, and the City of Toronto developed ours and adopted it in 2021, and then adopted in 2022 our action plan. And the goal you'll see in those concentric circles in the left-hand side, the goal is, oftentimes if you look at the middle, the red, which is the emergency response, everybody focuses on that. Who's going to respond to this incident? But nobody really thinks about the other circle outside, who's at risk of falling into an emergency? Those who are precariously housed, those who have food insecurity, and then thinking about the other circle outside. How do we help prevent people from falling into food insecurity, ensuring that people are adequately housed? And then thinking even bigger, how do we help fund and design a broader system that supports all people, considering the social determinants of health in terms of what are some of the barriers people face so they don't fall into an emergency crisis. So it's trying to broaden our thinking so that we don't just get stuck on responding to things and then we have this constant cycle. Because if you have conversations with law enforcement organizations, they'll tell you that the police cannot solve social problems. That's a fact. We as a society have broader responsibilities to think about what kind of society are we building that's inclusive, that addresses some of the barriers faced by most systemic by our members of society that face the most discrimination and marginalization, and how are we building a society that allows all to prosper, and that allows us to shift away from an emergency response system to a more social development system. So with that in mind, in the next slide, you'll see that there were 4 key actions that we had to undertake this year. One is the Toronto Community Crisis Service, which is part of this rethinking. The second one is an office to prevent gun violence or prevent violence. This is the first time the City of Toronto has developed an office that has multiple stakeholders involved. So the school boards are part of this office, the police are part of this office, and the idea is we've always had siloed responses. If an issue was percolating within the schools, the city would not know and the police would not know until that situation reached a critical tipping point. So now the idea is to engage and to help support and try and intervene and prevent issues before they arise. We also have a community crisis response program that responds to communities that face violence in terms of gun or knife or other type of violent incidents. And the part of the strategy is to broaden and support that organization and that response. Last but not least, going back to data, the idea is to help also build out a greater understanding of data and what data we can use to analyze across different partners to be able to understand what are some of the upstream issues, what are potential issues that are about to erupt, and how do we help respond quicker. There is also a tie-in to other key priorities around safety, and I don't want to gloss over these issues, but I want to just highlight them. One is the city's obligations, part of the actions under the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Call, MMIWG. Also the need to, and the recommendations by City Council for broader policing reform. Also conversations around safety in the TTC. The role around school and community safety, well-being, and then engagement with the business improvement areas, BIAs, and how do we engage with them on safety, and also the recommendation around the Ministry of Attorney General's Justice Centers. The Justice Centers are an initiative funded by the ministry to support diversion for Indigenous, Black, and equity-seeking community members and others who have been charged with crimes that are low acuity to see if there's other alternative ways that we can help support people. So those are some of the initiatives. I feel like I'm over time, so I'm going to try and wrap up, but I think this is my last slide, right? Okay, cool. So I guess I'm on time. So I think just to wrap up, I wanted to highlight some of the opportunities that exist within Social Development Finance Administration. There's lots of jobs that we have. The jobs range from frontline to senior management. An agency review officer is just one example. I talked about how we have $25 million worth of community grants that we support community and give out to various different not-for-profit partners. Well, we need staff to help facilitate that. And that's what an agency review officer does. They help review the requirements. They help support applications. They host town halls so people know what grants are available and they get the word out. And then they do the back-end administration in terms of flowing through those dollars and supports to different communities. If you're a numbers person, we have budget people that help support thinking about how do we track all these dollars, the $128 million in our division. But if you're more about being out in the community, we have community development officers who are in the community. They go to community events, they engage with community, they help mobilize community, they understand community needs, and they bring that back to City Hall and help inform our policies and our programs. And oftentimes that goes towards our policy development officers who help shape those policies. That's a role that I had in. So there's lots of different roles. I encourage you to check out the city's website, and I do have my contact information at the end of the slide, so do not hesitate to reach out if you have any further questions or interested in any opportunities of the City of Toronto. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you for sharing all of the variety of programs and initiatives that your office undertakes to help build capacity in community, from the lived experience councils to the Toronto Community Crisis Center. I learned so much, so thank you. And next we have Jennifer LaFontaine, consultant with the Indigenous Affairs Office. I'm just going to switch spots.
Right? So that's why I'm here in this spot. Okay, so thank you everybody for having me. So I work in the Indigenous Affairs Office. We are 12 people in our division. So it's really little, but we work with every division in the city to advance First Nation, Inuit, and Métis experiences in the city. Okay, next slide. So what really resonated with me when I was asked to make this presentation was that, you know, as students, you may be wondering about your career path. And I did want to tell you a little bit about how I got here. I've worked in the city for 2 years, but previous to that, I worked in the nonprofit sector and as an artist, specifically as a community artist. And so storytelling is really important to me. And that work I have done as an artist, you'll be surprised how much that enters into my work within my job here. So I'm just starting with a quote. This is Marilyn Dumont, who's a beautiful Métis writer and poet. And she says, this is a story shaped by you, as big as your words or as long as your sentences. This is your story, even though you haven't told it all or don't know how to tell parts of it yet. By starting the story tells you how to go on and how to look back. So, oh, thank you. Okay, great. So I started with this quote because who you are is so important to what you bring to your job. And the more diverse city staff and city council are, the more strong we are as a municipal government. There was a big win this week in politics for the Indigenous community. Who can tell me what it is? It is quiz time. Yeah. Yes, what happened? Yes. So, and why does that matter?
Well,
yeah, go ahead, keep going.
well, Manitoba is just like obviously there's a heavy, well, obviously there's an anti-Indian versus involvement in all of Canada, but it's very heavily represented, especially in Manitoba and Winnipeg.
Yeah.
So that relationship is always big for us.
Yeah, and does anybody else have something to add? Thank you so much.
He's also the first Indigenous premier in Canada.
Yeah, interesting misinformation, that one. He's not the first Indigenous premier. What is he? Yeah.
So the first, I believe, First Nations premier?
Yes. Janice talked about the importance of specific language, and it really makes a difference. So the first Métis premier in Manitoba was in 1887, was John Norquay. And so we tend to bundle. We go First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, like, or we say Indigenous. And in fact, Indigenous is a global term. Indigenous is all the First Peoples around the world. It doesn't actually minimize anything that he's the First Nations person versus the first Indigenous person. It's a significant role. How many Indigenous or First Nation, Inuit, Métis city councillors do we have? Put your hand up, somebody tell me. Just make a guess. Somebody make a guess. Zero. How many have we ever had? Zero, right? So for me to think that I should work at City Hall is like looking for a reflection of myself, looking for a place. And so I didn't particularly think that this was a place that I belonged or that I could get a job at. And so it took a lot of courage for me to apply for that, and other First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people even more so. So I'm gonna, next slide. This is my grandpa. My grandpa is Joe LaFontaine, and I share this photo with you to let you know that when I was growing up, I knew that he was Métis, but that's pretty much all that I knew. When my dad was about my age, he was invited by his dad, Joe, to go to Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. And he was just, and he only invited my dad because his vision was going and he wasn't safe to drive anymore. We lived in British Columbia. So he was like, can you give me a ride? I need to go to this party. So we went to a 60th wedding anniversary of a very important person to him. It was his auntie. And my grandpa did 1 year of school when he was 13 years old. And she was the one who, like, he lived with her so that he could go to a public school. Up until then, his family had moved him around from like family to family. He was one of what's called the hidden children. So if you know, with residential schools, like the RCMP would swoop into a community and just grab all the kids, literally grab all the kids. So part of that process was hiding the kids to have them not be found. So that was his experience. He did not go to residential school, but he was hidden from that experience. He was kept from it, but he was also kept from his education. He only did 1 year of school. But at this moment, nobody knew any of that story. In fact, they didn't know any of the stories because when my dad went back to Duck Lake, Saskatchewan, that was the first time that he met his Métis family. And it took him a while to even know that that's what was happening. He was like, what language is my dad speaking? Who are all these people? And so that would have been in the late 1970s. This wasn't just my grandpa's experience. It was the Métis experience in Canada because our leader, Louis Riel, was executed by the Canadian government. So again, going back to seeing ourselves in government, seeing our place in government, it's hard to have trust for an institution when that government was set to quash your own community's right to land, right to place, right to belonging in this country. Okay. Okay, next slide. So before I began here, I had a 20-year career doing media and storytelling. And even though that first slide was talking about sharing your own story, and even though I have a start to that story from my family experience, I didn't have a lot of courage to talk about being Métis for a long time. What I did do, but I had a hint that that was important for a lot of years. And what I did do was focus on storytelling about individuals telling their life stories through media and through storytelling as a tool for social change. So I started off at Central Neighborhood House. It's a community agency in the downtown East End in the women's program. I taught black and white photography. And we used those photo exhibits to tell the stories of our experiences, to advocate for change, to talk about experiences of racialized women, of low-income women in the downtown East End, and what we needed for a better city. And so my first experience for looking at better cities was advocating within the nonprofit sector. I then extended that to do media and storytelling locally, nationally, and internationally. And one of the methodologies I used was digital storytelling. In fact, I talked with Sarah Diamond about working on an international project that she was connected with in Jamaica, doing digital storytelling there. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to share a digital story with you, but also, September 30th just happened. So this is also, in honor of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, taking some space in City Hall to hear our language. And this story is told in Kanyakeha or Mohawk by Nathan Brinklow. So whoever my person is, if you could play the video, please. There's a link attached to that slide in the notes. Yeah, there we go. You should be able to play it from there. If not, just put it into, just highlight it into Google. You can maximize that. And it needs sound. So this digital story was part of a project with the Kingston Indigenous Languages Nest. They were Yay! As soon as I started this call. Okay. Thank you.
Muriel yonda jetsque ne deo sutsarane oxota. Gote gejek geronda quegina jagunhes. Acta 1916 siostra zedum, Runwaniha, wasogo yadinye de nagamha jine residential school, nona waehi e nagonistaha. Oswego yamdewianste skatne yunda degon ogua. The Mohawk Institute wahadina dune jerhonsaga, nekti wa ungwana dune
That story was from the Kingston Indigenous Languages Nest. It was a group working on language revitalization, and these were stories by Indigenous community members in the Kingston area, sharing their stories of learning language. So when I just mentioned that my dad heard his dad speaking fluently, he was speaking fluently in Cree, he would have spoken French, he would have spoken Michif, which is a Cree French dialects. All of those languages weren't passed down through our families, and that is intentional. That's part of the genocide strategy. That's part of assimilation to do that. Okay, moving on. Okay, so where I've brought us now is to the Indigenous Affairs Office. You can also look up the Reconciliation Action Plan, which is our 10-year strategy for truth, justice, and reconciliation. What I'm going to share with you is my particular role, which is looking at placekeeping. And placekeeping is an approach to city building that prioritizes ecological, historical, and cultural relationships in the care of place. So when I'm working on placekeeping, I'm looking at access to land and waters. I'm looking at the visible landscape of Toronto. If you were a visitor to Toronto, would you have any sense that there was Indigenous history here or a contemporary urban Indigenous community? Would you know what treaty land you're on? How do you experience that walking down the streets? Okay, so next slide, please. So to that end, here are some of the communities that we know. You might hear them in land acknowledgements, but just giving a bit of context. The Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, particularly the Seneca, are historically significant nations who occupied the land here, who it was their traditional territories, but through migrations and movement and politics, the treaty partners are the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties, First Nations. Williams Treaties is Scarborough and East. We also have a vibrant urban Indigenous community, and that includes people who are guests on this land, like myself, the Métis, the Inuit, and nations across Turtle Island. They all live here. There's upwards of 100,000 Indigenous people in Toronto. Census data might say something more like 20 or 30,000, strongly 80,000 or more. That's again around trust. How do we identify who we are? How do we participate in government surveys? Why would we do that? And so on. So if you can imagine it like a triangle, there's historically significant communities, there's treaty partners, and there's the urban community. And all of those voices are essential to how we live and work and play in Toronto. Okay, next slide. So the frameworking goals are to expand and ensure presentation and commemoration of Indigenous histories and cultures, to create space, physically and in process and policy for ceremony, teaching, and community, strengthening Indigenous connections with lands and waters, both traditionally and contemporarily, and building capacity for land-based Indigenous engagement. Okay, so next slide. Oh, actually, no, hold on one second. Did anybody see this beautiful exhibit? It was on about a year ago at the waterfront. It was at the beaches area, Ashbridges Bay. Just to acknowledge, 2 days ago was the Sisters in Spirit honoring day for two missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Sorry, I tripped over my acronym there. So October 4th is a day to honor women across the country who are missing and murdered. This exhibit was created to raise awareness. So when we talk about placekeeping, when I talk about a visible presence, if you're walking at the beaches and you walk through these massive banners with these beautiful pillars of wood, then it invites you to think about what experiences those Indigenous women and their families have had. Okay, this is what placekeeping is about, is putting visible markers that invite us to engage and understand an Indigenous experience. Next slide. This is a round dance that has happened at one of our community gatherings. Placekeeping is about taking up space and being able to have our ceremonies, have our cultural events in Toronto, in this city. Next slide. Why does this matter? So y'all probably at this point know about residential schools. It's talked about more, but there were so many strategies as part of this attempt of genocide on Indigenous people in Canada. Beyond residential schools was a pillar for that, right? But there were multiple other laws and policies that contributed to that effort. One of them was a law that was banning all cultural practices, potlatch ceremonies, powwows, any dancing, any singing, any drumming, any gathering. All of it was illegal from the late 1800s, and then the final removal of those laws was in 1951. It's not that long ago. So you can imagine when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we're also talking about the intergenerational trauma of stripping us of our rights to culture. So when I say that my grandpa didn't pass that language on to my dad, who didn't pass it on to me, it had a legal framework to make that happen, that made speaking language illegal, that made our cultural practice illegal. So those ceremonies, the banning of ceremonies is still, even though that was a federal law, there are all of these little bylaws and little other laws that still exist. They're separate, they're all over the place, but they still are culturally oppressive to us. So for example, the provincial fire code does not allow for sacred fires. We're looking for an amendment to that, to just have provincially, we can have sacred fires, okay? There are bylaws that say you can't harvest. So if I can't harvest medicines in the city, and those medicines are essential to my ceremonies, then that's still a culturally oppressive law that the city is responsible for. So part of Indigenous Affairs is looking at how to make those, how to change those policies, those procedures, those laws, so that we can feel like we can take up space in the city. That's what placekeeping is. This painting is by Kent Monkman, amazing artist, check him out. This is obviously about residential school. When I was talking about the hidden children, about my grandpa hiding, this is what they're hiding from, children being stripped literally from their parents' arms. Next slide. So places and naming, I'm gonna just take 2 more minutes. I feel like we're closing in on needing to discuss things. But creating places for us to gather. So I was at this beautiful ceremony to erect a wigwam. So this is a space for teachings, for ceremonies. What will happen after this moment is that they would cover that in a heavy canvas. So it's a beautiful space to gather. But these spaces are challenging. Parks, Forestry and Recreation is like, oh no, what do we do? Somebody wants to put this in a park. How do we figure this out? And so we work with those different divisions to help them make a smooth path for Indigenous community to be able to gather on the land. Gathering on the land is so important because we don't have churches and mosques or temples. Where we have ceremony is on the land. So that's where we need to gather. Next slide. Naming. So when I talked about a visible presence, think about all the colonial names. Some of you might be at a university who used to have a very colonial name that was changed. That's really important. So is having, this is a new park and community center. Etananonawastina is a Wendat name. This community center is very close to a Wendat historical village that, and Etananonawastina means where they lived long, good lives. And that was a time where it was like centuries of peace for that Wendat community. They thrived there. And this is in North York. It's at Shepherd and Leslie area. So working to have street names, park names, community center names, having our cultures and our languages reflected. If I can't see my language, if I can't hear my language, I don't believe that I have the right to my language. Okay, next, and y'all need to learn it, right? So go on the web, go find Counselor Carol teaching you how to say Etananonawastina. We need to have our languages alive, and we need to take responsibility for that for all people. And if you come from cultures that Janice and I were talking about, how language isn't passed down for so many cultural communities, that's part of an assimilative practice for all people in Canada. And the more that we keep those languages or learn those languages, the more our true selves are part of our work and our identities. Okay, and last bit, art. Take a look around. There are so many beautiful murals in the city now because Street Art Toronto is working with Indigenous communities to again, increase a visible presence of our cultures and identities in the city. And finally, moving to the next slide. Oh, that's me drinking Sweetwater. So this is, again, harvesting means harvesting maple syrup. That's my son, Aiden. It's really important for us to do this Sweetwater harvest. And that would be an example of something that's against a bylaw in the city because I'm not allowed to harvest. What we do is we take that Sweetwater. We do boil some of it down for maple syrup because it's delicious and because it's one of our traditional foods. But we also share with our communities the sweet water that comes directly from the trees. This is a grief medicine. So we drink that as part of spring ceremony to let go of grief that happens through our winter, that grief that we experience through the losses over that time period. And spring, as we all know, is a time for renewal. So drinking that first medicine, it's the first thing that gets harvested in the spring, gives us this energy, gives us actual sugars. It gives us so many healing nutrients to start through to the spring. Next slide. There are, so bringing things together now. I started in environmental studies. I moved to being an artist. I work at the city on placekeeping to increase spaces and places for Indigenous people across Toronto. And I myself do that too. So wrapping this up, I work with a group called Sweetgrass Roots. We do earthwork, art, and storytelling. So we took these Sweetwater buckets to gather the Sweetwater. We created art on them, and we embedded stories, audio stories right on the Sweetwater buckets so that you could hear our stories and our languages as you walked through the woods. And I'm gonna leave it, oh no, let me tell you one last thing, sorry. I'm so long, so one last slide. Yep, so this is a beautiful mural at King and Liberty Village area. It is that's Cree-Syllabic, so that's one of my languages. It means Otina, which is city. And here's why language matters. Because city in Cree means a collection of hearts coming together. And if you can believe that that's what a city is, if you can understand that all of your hearts coming together and all of who you are matters in this city, you can see how you can create a better city for yourselves moving forward. Thank you. Marcy.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for bringing your story here to us in City Hall, showing us the importance of storytelling and teaching us about placekeeping. That was really, really amazing. And thank you to all the speakers. I have hundreds of questions. You gave us so much food for thought, but for the sake of time, I will open up the floor right now for anyone who has questions. Yes, I see a hand in the back. Yes, you can come here and ask your question into the mic.
Hi, okay, good. First of all, good morning, everyone, and I would like to thank Janice, Jennifer, and Mohammed for the very insightful presentations that all of you have provided. I understand, I did a cursory review about the Confronting Anti-Black Racism plan, and I noticed that, they have a lot of updates, a lot of like progress updates that the CABR unit is giving out for their own action plan. And reflecting on Jennifer's presentation about the status of Indigenous communities in Canada and in Toronto right now, and understanding that the Reconciliation Action Plan was just released and approved just last year, so we are in year 1 of the implementation. May we expect similar level of like progress updates on the Reconciliation Action Plan as well, and like on all the other facets on top of the placekeeping initiatives that you have shared with us? Thank you.
Yes, so thanks. We did 1 year of the Reconciliation Action Plan this spring, and the plan is every 2 years to report to council as well as to community about progress made, and also looking at how evaluation can be done using an Indigenous worldview. So there will be quantitative markers, but also how do we understand what success is? How do we understand what progress is? And how do we understand that through storytelling, for example? So one of the things that I'm actually doing is merging my worlds, and I'm doing digital storytelling with city staff and with Indigenous community members to hear what impact the Reconciliation Action Plan has had or what progress has been made. So through people's own stories of working with each other, how can that help bring the Reconciliation Action Plan to life? So that's one example of using an Indigenous worldview of storytelling for evaluating. But yes, we're at the beginning of a 10-year plan. The Confronting Anti-Black Racism strategy just finished, is just in the process of finishing their 5-year strategy, and they're just going to be working on a 10-year plan now, right? 10 years is really, I think, a great thing because it gives you a long runway to acknowledge all the effort that needs to happen to make change.
Thank you so much once again.
I think we have time for about one more question, so your hand in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations. I learned a lot. Oh. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much for your presentations. I learned a lot. Kind of feels weird asking this question because you just said it in your answer. For Mohammed, it was about, because you were talking a lot about data and research, and I find in my experience, like my superiors, when we're talking about equity, they often want quantitative measures to measure the success of the plan that we're implementing. And I find a lot of these successes are not quantitative. So I was going to ask how we can show some of the qualitative successes from like the importance of community engagement, especially with community engagement. I find the superiors are always like looking for numbers from that, and it's so annoying. Jennifer just gave one example. I also like to use storytelling as a strategy, but what are some other ways that you can show the impact, like the qualitative impacts of your work?
Thank you for that question, and that's a great question. And I think far too often funders and governments rest too heavily on quantitative measures. So it's important that we supplement that with the stories of communities. So one example is, for example, with the Toronto Community Crisis Service, in our one-year evaluation, we incorporated the service user outcomes. What were the experiences of service users? We did focus groups that was led by our evaluator, CAMH, where they sat down with people who have used the service or family members who have used the service to share their stories and their experiences of the service, and also done surveys with them and focus groups to understand their stories. But we're also working towards a community report that tells the stories of impact, both from the experience of the crisis worker, but also experience of people who've received the service. And the goal is to release that community report in early February. So we're working towards that, but we're trying to use as many different methods as possible. Another initiative, the Community Healing Project, which is a peer-led mental health program that's funded by Social Development Finance Administration, engages youth through Instagram stories and Instagram posts to talk about their experiences with the program and to sort of share and take over the curation of their own stories. So that's another way that we highlight impact beyond a quantitative report. But I don't know if my other colleagues want to talk about. Oh, okay, sorry. I thought I heard you wanted to add. Okay.
Just one small example. So the Indigenous Affairs Office created a capacity building grant for grassroots groups and collectives. And so what they have for their reporting is they have an option. So they can write a written report. They can have a one-on-one visit where they share their experience. And we also have an annual feast at the end to bring all the groups together and they can share in a talking circle what the results of their project were. And so all of those kind of ways of breaking down how you evaluate and how you bring in different methods, that helps create a more dynamic, it makes people feel more seen and heard, right? Because when you send in a report, you're like, did anybody read it? Did you know? But when you gather with your community and you're all together saying like, look what we did, and we're going to honor each other, then it changes our experience with the city.
If I can just add one other piece in. So a lot of the work that we do in equity and human rights is corporate focused. Like we're working with our divisions. But one thing that we have is, for example, the Equity Lens tool, which is kind of learning, teaching, building capacity for folks to understand how to embed equity into their work. One of the ways we do that is, for example, through case studies. And I think that there's this idea of this notion of, I'm trying to think about how we can be more transparent as government. And it's not just, patting ourselves on the back and saying, oh, we're doing all these great things, but sometimes highlighting failures. How are we failing forward so that like every different division doesn't have to make that same mistake, but we're also celebrating like lessons learned. In government, often there's this idea of like, there's no room for error, but I want to challenge anyone to think about an innovative space or company that hasn't had stumbling blocks along the way. But it's not about avoiding failure. It's about how are we obviously mitigating, doing our due diligence to make sure we're being proactive. But if and when we do fail, and it's just a matter of life, how are we spreading that lesson so we're not making the same mistakes over again, but we're being transparent with community that, yeah, we misread the situation, we didn't act maybe in the best way that we could, but this is how we're gonna make sure that mistake doesn't happen again. And we do that through case studies so that, we're doing those horizontal learnings and we're grounding it in those practical lessons of what we can do better in government to serve communities as well.
Thank you so much. I'll now hand it over to my students from U of T, Sarah, Hali, and Tommy, to provide some very brief remarks and a thank you.
Distinguished speakers, professors, and fellow students, as we wrap up this insightful session at the City Hall, I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed speaker, Jennifer Lafontaine. Jennifer, learning about the city's relationship with Indigenous communities, the role of Indigenous Affairs Office in the representation of Indigenous people, and the importance of storytelling has been truly eye-opening. As University of Toronto students, our pursuit of knowledge is not limited to textbooks. It extends to understanding our community and the complexities that lie within. The presentation today has achieved precisely that by deepening our understanding of the importance of connecting with Indigenous communities. Jennifer Lafontaine has not only shared her expertise, but also ignited a shared passion, reminding us of our roles in this vital journey. Through her words, we have gained insights into the city's path towards reconciliation and the steps it has taken to bridge the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. This knowledge equips us with the tools needed to be informed, compassionate, and most importantly, active citizens engaged in contributing to the ongoing process of connecting with Indigenous communities. On behalf of the University of Toronto students and other students here, I extend our deepest thanks to Jennifer Lafontaine for her enlightening presentation. Jennifer, thank you for helping us better understand the way forward in our city's relationship with Indigenous communities. And last but not least, a heartfelt thank you to Professor Mehta for providing us with this exceptional learning opportunity. Thank you.
My deepest gratitude to you all for your exceptional contributions to our community. Mohammed, your presence as an immigrant member of our local council has brought important perspectives and unwavering dedication to the betterment of our city. We are proud to witness firsthand how you facilitated community empowerment by providing grants and seed funding for supporting our diverse youth. Your advocacy for Toronto for All campaigns promoting dialogue against all form of discrimination activates conversations and building resources for policies for a more equitable city tomorrow. Your activism has also highlighted the importance of our resources like Save Toronto, Toronto Community Services, Toronto Community Crisis Services, and the need to acknowledge the disproportionate impact of safety concerns on marginalized communities, and emphasizing the shared responsibility in supporting our equity-deserving communities. Thank you all again for your significant impact to an inclusive and equitable Toronto, and for your equal contributions and exceptional contributions to tomorrow. I look forward to being part of and continuing your journey towards a better city by your example and your inspiration. Thank you lastly, Aditi, for facilitating this and being a supportive professor. Thank you all.
Last but not least, I would like to express my deepest thanks and gratitude to our first speaker, Janice Alvarez, the Project Director for People and Equity, for a wonderful presentation of the importance of understanding equity in the city and the differences between equity and equality. And I thought it was particularly important, the emphasis you placed on removing systemic barriers and not just focusing on singular events focused on equity. And I also appreciate the importance you placed on accountability as an opportunity to drive impact, and the importance of creating a space where equity is important and prioritized in the city, especially from a financial aspect. So once again, thank you, Janice. Thank you to all the speakers for a wonderful presentation on understanding equity and all the considerations and work your office is doing for the future of equity in the city. And I'd also like to thank again Aditi for being a wonderful professor and facilitating this discussion. Thank you.
So I echo my students' thank yous. That was really amazing, really hopeful, really inspiring. We all have so much to discuss back at our universities next week. And so I'm going to close out. We're a little bit over time. So I have a couple of announcements. So thank you everyone for being here. And again, a huge thanks to the speakers. Our next session will be in council chambers on October 20th. And that session is community resilience, people, housing, and neighborhoods. And also just a reminder to students from U of T, OCAD, and York, if you haven't NTMU, if you haven't found a student from another institution for your collaborative assignment, you should do that today after class. And we'll be also having a meet and greet after the October 20th session. On November 3rd, after class, there'll be a public art and architecture tour with Professor Diamond and Professor Kedzior. So mark your calendars if that sounds interesting. And lastly, on November 15th, there'll be a Civic Lab TO Symposium on climate action from 2 to 4 p.m. at Centennial College. The event will be in person and virtual, and more details to follow, so look out for that. Thank you again to everyone and to, of course, our amazing panelists.